Hello, and welcome to another retzone.ca video. Today, I would like to speak about a video game company that has been part of my childhood memories. My earliest memories of video games are around the time when my father brought home our Atari 2600 console, and we could not get enough of that system. When I was a kid, my dad was a mainframe programmer, so technology was both his career and a hobby to him as well. We also spent many hours typing in basic programs into our Timex Sinclair 1000 computer with that horrible membrane keyboard. After that, we owned a Coleco Adam computer and a Commodore 128 as well. The Commodore 128 basically stayed in C64 mode because there was zero software for the Commodore 128. Capcom was one of my favorite video game companies from my childhood. The first game I played from them was a Ghost and Goblins cocktail arcade machine that was in my local fast food restaurant. Other games from that time include Contra and Jackal by Konami, which I will speak about in another video. The Capcom that we know today didn't really exist until 1989. Kenzo Sugimoto founded a company called IRM while he was still president of IREM. Kind of ironic, isn't it? IREM was another huge video game publisher from Japan, which would later release the game R-Type, one of their most famous arcade games. IRM also started another company called Capsule Computers. Later, they would combine and change their name to Sanbi in 1981. Sugimoto later founded Capcom in June of 1983, which is a combination of the name Capsule Computers, which is what they called their arcade machines in Japan. The intent was creating an international sales company. In 1989, the original Capcom Limited merged with Sanbi Limited to form an international company called Capcom, the company that we know today. In 1991, Capcom would acquire and purchase Unica Company Limited to get a foothold in the market of operating pachinko parlors, karaoke, supermarkets, cafes, and pubs. Capcom's first coin-operated games were Little League and Fever Chance in 1983, and in 1984, they released Vulgus, their first graphical arcade game. Later, in 1985, they would release a port of 1942 for the Nintendo Entertainment System, and that got them into the home console game market. Capcom's USA division in the 1980s would also release games for the Commodore 64 and PC-DOS systems. Later, Capcom released games such as Resident Evil, also known as Biohazard in Japan, in 1996. This is one of their most famous games that ended up selling 107 million units. Capcom, at this point, still continued producing games for the Super Nintendo, which made them fall behind other companies that started to produce 3D-based arcade games. Later, Capcom would be known as a 2D graphics company, much like SNK's Neo Geo around the same time. This is the main reason I still prefer 2D games to this day. In June of 1987, Capcom would release the first Street Fighter game in the franchise and would sell 46 million units, with its sequel, Street Fighter II, being released in 1991. As a matter of fact, Street Fighter II and its variations continue to be played in arcades and home consoles to this day. Also in 1987, Capcom would release Mega Man, also known as Rockman in Japan, in 1987. Hey, Future Chris here. Can we just pause here for a second and take a look at this Mega Man box art for the Nintendo Entertainment System? What the hell is going on here? Whoever got the commission to draw this had never played the game. This looks absolutely ridiculous. Like, the guy, that's not even Mega Man. I don't know who that is, but that is not Mega Man. Are there palm trees in the game? It's been a while. I don't remember if they actually have palm trees in the game or not, but wow, just wow, guys. Anyway, done with my rant. Back to the video. Breath of Fire, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney, and Dragon's Dogma. My childhood memories include playing Capcom games such as Trojan, Mega Man 2, and Bionic Commando on my NES. In the arcade, I was playing Knights of the Round, Varth, and other CPS-1 titles. The difference between the NES console and the arcade CPS-1 titles blew my mind. Later, CPS-2 arcade systems would come out and I would be playing games such as Alien vs. Predator, Street Fighter, Alpha 1, 2, and 3. Back in the late 1990s, I actually owned a Street Fighter Alpha, a Final Fight arcade cabinet, as well as a Neo Geo MVS1 cabinet. So now you have a rundown of Capcom's history and how they got started.
Super Robot Rockman 世界の平和のため7つの武器を駆使して悪のロボット軍団を倒せ。アイテムいっぱい楽しさ抜群スーパーアドベンチャーゲームファミコンソフトロックマン好評発売中。Capcom.
Let's talk about why we are really here. Capcom's arcade releases and the hardware that ran them. Arcade hardware has always fascinated me, so let's have a look at what Capcom did with theirs and what they did down the road. The earliest arcade games had boards specific to each game, meaning companies would have to research and develop new hardware each time they released a new arcade game. Capcom, realizing they could save money, made one board with interchangeable ROM chips that resulted in the birth of the Capcom Play System 1. I'm sure that the home console market with cartridges at the time would have driven this change, since cartridges are just interchangeable ROM chips as well. Sega, to save money, derived all their home consoles using existing redesigned arcade boards that have been made cost-effective for home use. Two good examples include the Sega Saturn, which is basically a Sega STV Titan board stripped down for home use, as well as the Sega Dreamcast, which uses the Naomi arcade board architecture. But for an example more related to Capcom, their first real graphical arcade game was Vulgus. It was an 8-bit arcade board design that used dual Z80 processors clocked at 3 MHz each. Other games also released for this hardware include 1942, ATAX, X-Dice, which is also known as Savage Beast, and Pirate Ship Hijimaru. In 1987, Capcom released Street Fighter on a Motorola 68000 based arcade board with other games. The specs for this hardware are the following. Other games released for this hardware include Bionic Commando, Top Secret, F1 Dream, Last Duel, LED Storm, Mad Gear, Tiger Road, and Torii no Michi. Around 1990, Capcom released the Capcom Play System 1 or CPS-1 board. This board ended up having a long shelf life and had many games released for it, including the famous Street Fighter II franchise and its many variants. According to an interview by LCSM, to Koichi Usuke Yotsui, father of Capcom's hit title Strider, the Capcom Play System 1 was originally developed with the need to bring bigger and better graphics into new games, with full 16-bit capabilities, plenty of hardware sprites, tiles, and graphic layers. CPS-1 essentially extended game asset and code storage capacity beyond its lifetime needs. In fact, no game ever released on the CPS-1 used the full 4 MB of ROM capacity found in the system. The list of CPS-1 games is impressive. Here is the list. The CPS-1 system was Capcom standardizing its own game release cycle, and the new system gave birth to 35 new game titles with around 137 game revisions and market-specific localized versions. Its 16-bit design and capabilities served as a publishing vehicle for successful franchises such as Capcom's worldwide hit Street Fighter II. Unlike the previous arcade boards where they would tweak the specs of each board depending on the game that was released on it, the CPS-1 board had one spec for all games. Let's start with the A board. The A board is the base board that contains most of the system hardware, the CPU, the memory, the sound. Then we have the B board. This contains the ROMs for the specific game. The C board, which was later added, is a small satellite board containing a video logic custom chip and sometimes additional input-output. The prevalent opinion from the greater arcade expert community that the base specs of the CPS-1 are claimed to originate straight from the computer commercially known to the Western world as Sharp's X68000 otherwise known as the God computer. The Sharp X68000 is an extremely popular home computer in Japan. It used the same processor as what you would find in the Atari Falcon, the Commodore Amiga line of computers, and is also used in the Neo Geo MVS board. In 1993, Warriors of Fate was released with an updated CPS-1 design known as the CPS- or CPS 1.5. It had a 4-layer design featuring a new intermediate Q sound board. These components are all enclosed inside a hard case that includes an internal fan. This is the final update to the CPS-1 platform. One of the many milestones of CPS-1 is the reduction in the dependency of TTL chips. These are a family of logic chips widely used in the video arcade game industry since its very beginnings. TTL chips became the foundation for computers and other digital electronics. With the introduction of the CPS-1, Capcom also introduced several custom ASIC chips that brought new system capabilities as well as a significant reduction in board density and complexity. Just to clarify, ASICs are silicon chips designed for an extremely specific purpose, created to perform a repeated function very effectively, as opposed to general purpose chips which can perform an endless variety of functions but less efficiently, such as GPUs or CPUs. An ASIC, in essence, is basically a custom chip built on request to meet certain specifications. In more basic terms, think of it as a relatively easy way of integrating many off-the-shelf logic parts into just one part. A couple of these custom chips found in the CPS-1 are in the logic ASICs known as the A-XX and the B-XX. According to one release flyer from the UK distributor Electrocoin, the new system took about 2 years to develop and a total investment of about $5 million. Keep in mind though, this information is just a reference. The flyer appears to be full of market drivel, such as the claim about the system containing 3 68,000 CPU cores. At this point, Capcom saw what SNK's Neo Geo system was doing and attempted to make their own home arcade console to compete with the Neo Geo AES. It was called the CPS Changer, and it was a mail-order only CPS-1 home console that used scaled-down arcade boards as cartridges. It was a very short-lived system and not many units were sold. It was basically a supernova for CPS boards. If you notice, the system used what appears to be Super Nintendo style connectors. But what is a supernova, you ask? A supernova allows you to connect a JAMA arcade board to a regular consumer TV with sound and controllers like a home console. JAMA is an agreed upon arcade standard for the edge connector for several arcade boards that include the CPS-1 and the CPS-2. Around May of 1995, the CPS board was officially discontinued after a long and prosperous release. Many CPS-1 boards survive to this day and are preserved by many collectors. In 1993, Capcom released a successor to CPS-1, the CPS-2, or the Capcom Play System 2. Capcom, wanting to combat the massive piracy and bootlegs that appeared on the CPS-1, the CPS-2 board employed a lot of encryption, with the keys being held in battery-backed RAM. Hence, when this battery died, the board suicides and is rendered useless, and this is where the term suicide battery comes from. However, thanks to the hard work of emulations fans such as Andreas Naive and Nicolas Salmoria, the boards have now been decrypted, allowing restoration of arcade boards that have suicided, and has made emulating CPS-2 now possible as well. The CPS-2 boards were designed with an A and B configuration. The A board is the main board that holds all the hardware required to run the game, and the B board would contain the different games and could be swapped out. CPS-2 board's hardware is remarkably similar in specifications to CPS-1. A total of 44 games were released for the CPS-2. The CPS-2, like the CPS-1, had a long life and was discontinued in 2003, 10 years after it was introduced. After CPS-2, Capcom decided to release another arcade board, the Capcom Play System 3 or CPS-3. This board contained a completely different setup and unfortunately did not last long compared to either CPS-1 or CPS-2. Like CPS-2, Capcom wanted to make pirating the system exceedingly difficult. CPS-3 games usually came on a CD, and the BIOS and processor are placed on carts that includes massive encryption. When the CPS3 board is first powered on, the contents of the CD are loaded into a bank of sims on the motherboard, where there it is executed. The program code is then decrypted and run via the security cartridge. The security cartridge itself is very sensitive to any sort of tampering, which will result in the decryption key being erased and the cartridge being rendered useless. Games became unplayable when the suicide battery inside the cartridge dies. The one lone exception to this is the Street Fighter 3 Second Impact, which uses default set of decryption keys that are written to the dead cartridges on boot. I wonder if the design and setup of CPS3 made it difficult to make games for it, as the list of games for it is noticeably short. The CPS2 actually outlived the CPS3, and if you look at the release dates for some of the games, the last CPS3 game came out in 1999, while the CPS2 system itself was discontinued in 2003. Here is a list of CPS2 games that came out in 1999 after the CPS3 was discontinued. All these games came out after the CPS3 was discontinued. It's possible that these games were still in development when CPS3 was launched, so they came out for the CPS2. But the market was changing, and soon, Capcom itself turned to making games for Sega's Naomi board instead. Naomi stands for New Arcade Operation Machine Idea, and is the arcade board designed in tandem with Sega's last home console, the Dreamcast. After reading some forum posts on the internet, the apparent reason for Capcom moving to Sega's Naomi arcade hardware are the following. People wanted games to go 3D, arcades were becoming obsolete, and the CPS3 hardware was very fragile. Another point to consider is that Capcom's next major Street Fighter game, Street Fighter 3, was also not well liked by people, and it has been deemed a failure. Capcom, instead of spending money developing a possible CPS4 system that did 3D, decided instead to acquire a license for Naomi boards from Sega and made 3D arcade games for that instead. The list of Capcom Naomi games is similarly small as well. Arcades around my area pretty much dried up before the CPS3 even came out, so I never got a chance to play these myself. Luckily, thanks to home console ports and emulation, I've been able to try most of these except Spawn, which I wasn't even aware was a game on CPS3. After CPS3 ended up not being popular with arcade goers, Capcom stopped developing their own arcade boards. Here's a list of boards that Capcom used for their arcade games. Unfortunately, current arcade hardware is now just off-the-shelf PCs running Windows. Due to this, the magic of arcade hardware is dead to me. I am an IT guy, and the thought of arcade games running Microsoft Windows hurts me inside personally. We at least had a look at Capcom's rich history in the arcades and how they seem to survive in the modern time. Thanks to emulation and home console ports, we can still continue to enjoy these classic arcade games. I want to thank you for taking this personal journey with me. I hope you learned something today as I share my history and knowledge of this awesome company whose games I still play today and probably will forever. The next game will focus on another beloved game company, Konami. I will focus on their arcade games and touch on their home console releases as well. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content from us at retzone.ca, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.